Hi guys, so in my last video I made a goal to use all of my art supplies this year. So in this video I decided to experiment a bit with those poster paints that I had showed in the video. I've had these paints for about 10 years and from what I could remember of them they were pretty thick and behaved a lot like gouache. I would actually love to buy some real gouache someday, but right now, I can't justify making that purchase, so I decided I would have to make these paints do. And it would be a good test to see if I actually like the medium since it's so similar to gouache in the first place. Alright, so upon opening these, they were almost all completely dry. With the exception of a few like the dark green, but it was still really thick. Most of them had hardened to little bricks in their pots. Some were moldy even, and that was surprising to me because I've had these paints for a while and I've re-wet them, reconstituted them several times, and they were always fine. But this time the red and then the purple were moldy. The red just had a little speck. The purple was completely covered. I ended up having to scrape that off and just like discard that top layer. Hopefully that helps and it doesn't regrow the mold. I'm not sure how that's going to work. So here you can see me just going through them and adding water to the actual paints, and it actually took a few weeks for them to fully hydrate. I don't think they've ever taken that long to become juicy again, but the last time I even opened these was probably 2 years ago. So I'm surprised, but I shouldn't be, that they needed this much attention. I put some water in them, left them for a few days, and then I had to kind of agitate them and stab into them because it started to get soft, but I wanted to help it along. Then I added a bit too much water to some and I ended up having to leave them to evaporate. Here you can see me trying out the texture of them after leaving them to sit for a while. And most of them reconstituted pretty well to the texture that I remember them having. So next I did some swatch testing. I put down a line of black ink on my sketchbook and just painted over it to see how much they covered up the line. I was pretty surprised by the outcome. The yellow, the orange, and the red. The yellow was a little thin, so I'm not completely surprised that the line is still showing through. But the latter half, from like the purple down to the gray, was pretty opaque, and well, you can't see anything through the black. And the white performed as well as I thought a white would perform anyway. While in use, the bottles are pretty annoying. They tend to cross thread a lot, so you'd have trouble opening them or getting them closed properly, and they're pretty messy. I realized I prefer palette setups, and that's definitely going to be a deterrent to me using these. I currently use some Magello tube watercolors, and I put them into a palette that I got from like Art Secret on AliExpress, and that is probably my ideal setup. I have everything laid out in front of me. I just open it, add water, and go. These ones you have to kind of open 12 bottles, and the bottles are finicky. and then you have to lay them out in front of you and then get a palette and transfer some into. And then you end up with excess paint on your palette. And I realized they don't re-wet as easily. They eventually do get back to the creamy kind of thick consistency that they come out of the bottle with, but it does take a while for them to fully rehydrate. If you try to use it too soon, it ends up being gravelly and weird. Okay, so I was pretty surprised by this initial color mixing test. There's a lot of the mixes held true to what I have learned from watercolors, and I was definitely happy with the range of colors I was able to mix and get out of these paints. And I realized that the color mixing and what you could get out of them really does come down to your knowledge as an artist, and not necessarily always the paints themselves. When they dried pretty matte or kind of chalky. I'm not sure if that's how gouache actually performs. I do notice that I prefer the transparency and luminosity of watercolors. I like having the paper shine through the paint, and there's this light eeriness, I don't know how else to describe it, feeling to your piece that I lost a lot using these paints. And I assume since gouache is a opaque watercolor medium that it would behave similarly. Oh, I was also surprised at being able to mix black using the orange and dark blue. That's a mix that I don't think I was able to achieve with my Reeves watercolors. I could be wrong. Oh, and the colors were opaque enough to cover each other up once the previous layer had dried, which is something that really hard to do in watercolor, but I know it's a staple asset in a gouache. The opacity of it and how much it's able to cover up or lay down over another color. Lighter colors dried darker and darker colors dried lighter, which is something I've also heard that gouache does as well. So now for the paintings, I had prepared 2 sketches to test these paints. I wanted something simple and then something detailed. The simple piece was like simple in drawing, so I just had like a set of eyes that I wanted to paint. I wanted to try doing a background wash just to see how it behaved when you thinned it out. I ended up not making it thin enough and I had to glaze it with some white. I wasn't very happy with these eyes, I'm not gonna lie, but it was just for the sake of the test. I realized it was pretty hard to get seamless washes, unlike with watercolor. It kind of dried streaky, or it had that kind of bloomy appearance. If you know watercolor, you kind of understand what I mean, where colors settle along the edges of a pool of water. If you know, you know. I'm thinking that if I had wet the paper completely first and then tried the wash, maybe that would have worked better. But I'm usually accustomed going in on a dry piece of watercolor paper, and as long as there's a pool of paint liquid on my paper, I can just continue to drag that further down the page and get a seamless or relatively seamless wash. Oh, and I realized the paints laid down fairly thickly. Mixing wasn't as seamless either. It took some skill to get stuff mixed, and it still came out textured. So gouache would definitely give you a more graphic, textured look in your pieces than watercolor would. Like, you can do that with watercolor, but you have to be intentional about it. For me, using these poster paints, it kind of came, this painterly look kind of came as a result of the medium. So that was definitely interesting. I'm not sure if that's just because I don't know how to use gouache, but I'm going to do some more tests with them and we will see how that works out. So you can see here I'm just adding in the final details. I noticed that it's a lot harder to get a point in my brush using these paints. I don't know if it's just because these paints are cheaper, so they have a lot more filler in them, versus a nicer gouache where it's thick but still workable. I'm not sure. So here's the first little test done. It's not too bad. It's not my favorite thing I've ever done, but it showcased how the gouache could work. Well, poster paints. Okay, so here now I'm mixing up some colors for the second piece. And this one I was pretty surprised with how it turned out. So I had this image from Instagram of two little monkeys being backlit. It looked like, I don't know, maybe early morning sunrise kind of portraiture. And I thought that would be a pretty good picture to use to test these out. So I went in with, I thought it was a thick enough wash, but it wasn't thick enough or dark enough. So this is just the first layer I'm putting down here of this kind of dark army green almost. It was pretty dark in the photo. So I ended up mixing a darker, like a purpley black and a darker green. I used that then to darken the green, and I added that to the edges of the painting because that's where the image was darkest. And again, I wasn't able to get a seamless blend. Maybe that's not the look you're supposed to be going for gouache. It's kind of what I like to do, at least for backgrounds. The paint's dried in some pretty funky ways. You could see my reaction here coming back to my palette the next day. You can see it re-wet pretty grainy and weird at first, but after a while of it soaking, it became smooth again. And I was very happy for that. One thing I noticed, trying to mix a really dark purpley green, it dried pretty gray actually. And I realized I wasn't able to get as dark of a color as I needed, so I ended up remixing the purple but using black instead to darken it, and that ended up sticking as a nice dark color instead of drying and turning gray. So the black definitely helps. In watercolors I don't even have a black, I usually mix my own. So again, this could just be because these are cheaper paints, or maybe you do actually need black in gouache to get nice dark mixes. I'm not sure. Now here came the really interesting part, getting or keeping my brush really fine to do all the little details on the monkeys. And that was definitely a challenge because I couldn't keep a fine point. I'm not sure what it is, but the paints were just too thick and they kept my bristles pretty splayed. I don't have the best brushes, they don't keep the finest point, but usually I'm able to do things like hair strokes and fine details. Something I did like about using these poster colors / gouache is you kind of have a freeness to just paint how you like in a way. I'm sure there are areas where you have to plan, but with watercolor you really have to sit down and think out when and where you're going to put down your colors, because if you put down a dark color you're not going to be able to have something lighter shining through it. adding some highlights on the branches. And here are the finished little monkeys. I was really happy with how they turned out. That was my first little test with these poster paints. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please leave a like and a comment, and subscribe if you want to see more of my little tests and art adventures going forward. And don't forget, it's not the supplies but the artist who makes the art. Keep creating, guys.